In prior videos, we considered the notions of parallax and minimal difference with regards to philosophy and theology. In Chapter 3, we turn our attention to their applicability to science and ethics, and in particular how cognitive neuroscience, or the cognitivist approach, affects our conceptions of consciousness and freedom. This was a particularly interesting chapter to me because, as some of you might know, my background is actually in clinical neuropsychology, and my primary courses I teach are in cognitive science and neuroscience. So I was uniquely interested in the way in which Zizek engaged these disciplines. So let's go and see how he does that. We begin Chapter 3 with a consideration of the relationship between appearance and reality, which naturally evokes Plato's ontology and his allegory of the cave. Briefly, the standard retelling of this allegory consists of a series of chained prisoners forced to look upon the wall of a cave where shadowy figures move and interact. The shadows are cast by objects behind the prisoners, which themselves are replicas of the real things, which can only be beheld upon emerging from the cave and seeing them in the light of the sun. One day, a prisoner is set free and discovers the truth of their situation upon ascending the cave and into the light of the sun. Upon returning to the cave to rescue the other prisoners, rather than be glad for being given the truth of their situation, these other prisoners turn on the freed individual, wishing to kill him. The standard interpretation of this allegory is that the shadows are the degraded appearances of reality, reality being what is considered that which is under the light of the sun, and especially the sun itself, which is equivalent to truth and goodness. One alternate interpretation Zizek provides comes from cognitive neuroscience. In this version, Plato is deemed correct concerning the division of appearance and reality, but with the major exception that there are no observing subjects in the cave. Instead, the cave itself is the self, representing the neurobiological machinery responsible for reflexively projecting an image, thereby forming a self-presentation or self-model of the cave. This theater of shadows is a human organism's way of experiencing itself, but without anyone behind the veil of the self-appearance. The observing self and the shadow are one and the same self-representation. This removal of any substantial self would seem to place cognitive neuroscience within an intellectual lineage of humiliations that reduce our humanity to something less central and grander than once conceived. The most radical version of this reductionism is exemplified by the Churchland's position, whose reductive materialism proposes that even the idea of consciousness itself is erroneous and not some positive concept worthy of exploration on its own terms. A less extreme version of this position, attributed to Daniel Dennett, is a non-reductive materialism that continues to posit the existence of consciousness, though understanding it as resulting from natural and evolutionary processes. Though I'm not sure how well this represents Dennett's position, since he proposes that the unity of consciousness is itself a cognitive illusion, a byproduct of so-called fame in the brain, according to his multiple drafts theory of consciousness. In contrast to these materialist positions, there are what Zizek identifies as more idealist or transcendental positions that either posit consciousness as fundamentally unknowable and unexplainable, or claim that consciousness cannot be accounted for by our present scientific theories, and that perhaps another fundamental force of the universe is required to explain it. Responses from psychoanalysts to these attempts to reduce consciousness to natural processes have been varied, ranging from a strong rejection of cognitive neuroscience to an affirmation but limitation upon its findings to only apply to that within the scientific horizon, all the way to an embrace of it, proclaiming that psychoanalysis long ago predicted what cognitive neuroscience has only recently established. And there is this field that is actually called neuropsychoanalysis that attempts to do empirical research validating psychoanalytic concepts from this neurological perspective. Zizek finds these psychoanalytic replies inadequate to the challenge of cognitive neuroscience. Rather than rejection, limitation, or assimilation, the path toward a genuine engagement between psychoanalysis and cognitive neuroscience must be through the inherent silences and contradictions of the latter. One notable contradiction Zizek highlights is how the more consciousness is considered marginal, unnecessary, and non-functional from a naturalistic perspective, the more enigmatic its emergence becomes. Given how consciousness appears to us, it seems truly bizarre to the degree we identify it as some kind of mistaken concept or at least some accidental epiphenomenon. At this point, it seems helpful to consider Zizek's ideas and interpretations concerning all that has been said so far. Regarding Plato's allegory of the cave, he offers a Lacanian interpretation wherein the real outside of the cave only shows itself in the gaps between shadows, as a kind of shadow among shadows. The interplay of appearances does not rid us of some kind of substantial reality. Instead, the irreducibility of these shifting appearances to any substantial support engenders its own thing, that is, the true real thing. It's helpful here to keep in mind what has already been discussed in previous videos concerning Lacan's concept of objet petit a as the imponderable X of an object, wherein our own subjectivity is inscribed and which constitutes the ontological incompleteness that is central to Zizek's materialism. In addressing the relationship between material reality and consciousness, Zizek posits another duality structurally similar to neurobiology and consciousness, that being material reality and the event. The event is a philosophical concept that identifies particular emergences irreducible to the order of positive being or neutral material reality. Consciousness itself, when it's accepted as a legitimate concept on its own, has often been thought of as an emergent property, something new that arises from pre-existing reality, but that we cannot analyze at the level of that pre-existing reality. And so consciousness is a kind of event of materiality. Now, although the notion of the event finds expression in other philosophers, it's Badiou's version that Zizek is most affirming of. Namely, the event is the grounds for a new truth procedure that's completely heterogeneous with the previously established order of being. The event explodes out of the gaps in this order, and no prior causal factors can ever account for its emergence. The question that Badiou raises then, according to Zizek, concerns how it is possible that we can break out of the network of causal connections of material reality to conceive of a truly free act, one in which the human animal forsakes its animality and puts its life in the service of a transcendental truth. This concern with freedom in the context of the event emerges out of Badiou's idea of evental recurrence, whereby the event relies on one who intervenes, and thereby recognizes the event as an event. And I should point out here that the question itself, though focused on freedom and thus also ethics, fully converges with the question concerning the emergence of consciousness. Indeed, freedom and consciousness are tightly linked here for Badiou, which is not all that surprising once we realize that one of Badiou's major influences was Jean-Paul Sartre, for whom freedom is defined as the being of consciousness, something I got into in my most recent video covering being and nothingness. Though largely affirming of Badiou's position, Zizek also seeks to go beyond his thought by proposing that there is nothing but the order of being itself, and that the event is not some beyond of being exploding out of it, but is always already implicated in the order of being, and that is because being is ontologically incomplete. In other words, being was never closed to begin with, and thus the event is the name for the non-self coincidence of being with itself. It's the curvature of the space of being, so to speak. And to the degree that the event here is consciousness and freedom, we can begin to see another convergence, this time with the Lacanian notion of objet petit a as the inscription of subjectivity within material reality. The implication of this is that the non-knowability of consciousness is not a problem for consciousness, but its constitutive element. Not being knowable is a critical feature of subjectivity, for without it, subjectivity loses its status and turns into some kind of transparent machine. And I would add that it seems not only necessary for consciousness, but also for material reality, since subjectivity, and in particular that aspect of consciousness we call the unconscious, is constitutive of material reality in its fundamental incompleteness. So another way to think of this essential non-knowability of consciousness is in terms of intersubjectivity. To really know the mind of the other in full transparency, to have immediate access to it, would mean the necessary gap that produces otherness would itself disappear. And then what remains is merely the relating to myself, like a kind of self-reflexive system, not unlike the cognitive neuroscience interpretation of Plato's cave. Hence why cognitive neuroscience faces contradiction when it attempts to explain consciousness purely in terms of a reductive materialism, because it cannot incorporate the incompleteness of that materiality, and thus the non-knowability that's intrinsic to consciousness. And so consciousness becomes a kind of vanishing mediator, to borrow a Lacanian term, in that as soon as I try to explain it, it disappears. It's only through a conception of material reality as ontologically incomplete that we can reincorporate consciousness without recourse to some kind of dualistic idealism. However, identifying the ontological basis of consciousness within a new kind of materialism still leaves open the question concerning the identity of this consciousness. What kind of meaning are we to attribute to the truth of consciousness? Herein, Zizek leads us to consider the gap between truth and meaning. If truth is how things are in themselves without a perspective, meaning is the perspective we provide to that reality, a perspective deriving from the socio-symbolic systems that constitute our subjectivity. On the extreme ends, reductive science attempts to discern truth no longer grounded in meaning, while the so-called postmodern perspective renounces truth and restricts us to the interplay of multiple meanings. The rupture between truth and meaning also becomes evident in light of the theological problem of evil. Paradigmatic is the biblical figure of Job, who encounters unimaginable suffering, but who resists any meaning his community attempts to offer him for it. And indeed, even God, when he finally makes his entrance, fails to offer any kind of meaning to structure the truth of Job's pain. Nonetheless, various theological responses have attempted to reconcile truth and meaning in the face of evil, ranging from those that seek to preserve God's unity and sovereignty by placing responsibility for evil on humanity, to those who have sought to limit God's power in some fashion, especially by introducing a dualistic solution wherein there is a good God and an evil God. Rather than opt for these monotheistic and Gnostic solutions, Zizek proposes the real task requires locating the split between good and evil within God himself, while still remaining within the field of monotheism. And so rather than the sovereign God or the finite God, we find here the suffering God. A suffering God necessarily implies some kind of involvement and a being affected by history. By locating this split between good and evil within God, there is thus an identification of the highest good with the most evil thing. And whether one appears or the other depends upon a parallax shift. For what looks like the supreme good from a distance becomes repulsive evil as one draws near. Christ, who is God, and thus positing the highest good, also freely identifies himself with this repulsive evil in humanity. And this evil is identified as God's own excrement. Thus there is a correspondence we find here between the deification of humanity and its deification, raising up the human to divine status and the identifying of that divine status with the excremental remainder of God. This identity is what gives Christ's love its ultimate meaning and grandeur, a love for the miserable excremental entity called the human. Now, what are the implications of this theological anthropology for our previous considerations of consciousness and materiality? I think it connects with Zizek's earlier consideration of concrete universality as the focal point for revolutionary ethics, wherein we collectively identify with that excremental remainder that exceeds all particular communal identifications. Though this interpretation is not something made explicit at the end of chapter 3. Rather, Zizek does draw two related tendencies that he identifies as emerging from this excremental identification of our humanity. First, there is a convergence with the humiliation of humanity as just merely another phenomenon of natural evolution. Second, and I think related to the first point, it converges with our being reduced to mere machines oscillating between pleasure principle and death drive, and wherein enjoyment becomes an ethical political category. To appreciate what that might mean, we should return to Zizek's earlier comment discussing the gap between meaning and truth. And in that section, he also marks capitalism as another case of this rupture, wherein the mechanisms of the global market are not situated in the field of meaning, since capitalism requires no particular culture or worldview for it to operate. Like a machine, it does what it does regardless of context. Powering this autonomous machine is the death drive, which disturbs all homeostasis and takes on a life of its own. And if we recall, there is this dialectic between drive and desire in capitalism that corresponds with the tension between pleasure principle and death drive that's being discussed here in the implication of the excremental identification of humanity. The lack of limits entailed in the capitalist system and the worldlessness it engenders, Zizek thinks, promotes the idea of a pure, direct, unmediated jouissance, which cognitive neuroscience and various brain-machine interfaces promise to offer. Such jouissance provides a detour through symbolic reality, bypassing all fantasy to directly activate the pleasure centers of the brain. Now, Zizek doesn't seem to be suggesting that this will necessarily actually happen, nor is he bemoaning the possibility. What he seems to be pointing out is the widespread expressed concern for the danger of these technologies to fundamentally alter our humanity, or perhaps bring about the end of humanity itself in our complete annihilation through, for example, some kind of technological singularity. When reading this part, I thought about the common concerns expressed toward the technological emergence of things that deliver this promise of immediacy. For example, we frequently hear of those concerns regarding children and how much they have at their fingertips with the emergence of tablets, social media, and the internet more generally. And similar concerns had previously been expressed following the pervasive access to television and even to the emergence of mass printing of books. One of Zizek's points here seems to be that those concerns are inadequate. The true catastrophe has, in a sense, already taken place, that we already experience ourselves as, in principle, organisms that are highly manipulable and not the expression of some unchangeable essence. Second, despite such concerns, we seem to constantly avoid this threatening immediacy by perpetually generating a pseudo-concreteness that enables us to relate to our complex technological environments through a kind of meaningful life world. Zizek uses the example of keyboards that feel like old-style typewriters, but I'm thinking about the recent updates to smartphones that provide a lot of haptic feedback, that we need not just have immediate access to knowledge and information through texting, for example, but we need to feel the experience of actually typing out the words, so the screens give this artificial sensation of pressing buttons. And these examples suggest that we're constantly seeking to reintroduce mediation into our world. And as such, rather than some pure jouissance leading to the breakdown of our symbolic universes, we seem to continuously try to reintegrate these new technologies into them. And as such, there remains a gap in reality that we're constantly trying to fill with imaginary meanings. We can imagine that machines or computers communicating with one another don't need this kind of mediation. That when one computer talks to another, it's a very direct line of communication with no gaps in it. But that's not how we as humans interact with our world. It's a gap that we've not gotten rid of, because we are, in a certain sense, the gap itself, the inscription of subjectivity within material reality. And within this reality, we confront our malleability and that we are totally determined. But at a more radical level, we also can retroactively return to the site of our determinism and confront our freedom. We discover here then a radical difference between, say, the hard Darwinist and the dialectician. The former speaks of the new emerging from an altered element within the old. For the dialectician, by contrast, at least as Hegel is understood here through Zizek, the new emerges as a structure, as a kind of event that reconfigures being, a new order not accounted for by the old, but one that is actualized only in the ethical repetition of the past that retrieves aborted possibilities, that introduces something completely new into our futures. And I think this is in part what Zizek means when he tries to look at Nietzsche's notion of the eternal recurrence, not in the way it's usually understood, but in the light of this concept of retroaction. In the next video, Zizek will continue his examination of cognitive neuroscience, taking up more specifically the scientific study of free will, its dialectical relationship to determinism, and the status of emotions. Along with liking, sharing, and subscribing, you can financially support this work using the Super Thanks button below this video. To be an ongoing supporter of this channel, I have a Patreon page where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritized questions and comments. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. And as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.